Hey everybody, happy Blockheads Wednesday. This week is week 21 of group 2, and our guest designer is Stephanie Sliwinski of Fancy That Design House, and her block is Square Burst. Stephanie is a first-time Moda Blockheads designer, and we are thrilled to have her join us for Blockheads 5, and she has designed a great block for us today. Back to some familiar components. We've got half square triangles and flying geese, and this is such a fun block. I've got my traditional block here, and I love how it turned out. I had so much fun piecing this one, and I really had fun because I just grabbed fabrics from my scrap pile that I've been collecting since I started Blockheads 5, and every week when I cut my fabrics, I just put aside the leftovers, and I've got a nice scrap pile. So I just dove in there, and I didn't really think too much about the fabric placement, and that ended up making for a very fun block. So let's grab our pattern and dive in. Today we're going to be making half square triangles and flying geese. So I've got my half square triangles right here. I'm actually cheating a little bit. I found these half square triangles from a previous block left over in my pile of scraps which I've been saving since we've started Blockheads 5. And they are 3 inches. I need to trim them to 1.5 inches for my 6-inch block. So I think if I cut carefully, it's a little bit larger than 3 inches. And I think I'm going to be able to get my 8 half square triangles out of these 4 larger ones. So I'm already kind of halfway done with the first step. So that's nice. It's fun to dig into your scrap pile and see what you can find and repurpose and reuse it. I knew that if I hung onto these, they'd come in handy at some point. Then I've got my C squares here. And then I have my E and D squares for my outer flying geese, and my G and F squares for my inner flying geese, and then my H square for the center of my block. I'm using a Moda woven this week in my block. This is from Fig Tree and Company's Denim and Daisies Wovens collection, and if you have not sewn with Moda Wovens before, you're missing out. They're so soft and really beautiful. I love the texture that they add to my quilts, and you don't need to be afraid of using wovens. The trick is to starch them if you really are worried about it. These are not starched because I cut them from a layer cake for a different project, so they're just kind of left over. But normally I would heavily starch my wovens, and that just helps slow down the fraying and makes them just a little bit easier to work with. But don't be afraid to try it out. I love mixing different textures in my quilt blocks, and our wovens are a great way to do that. The first step of our block this week is to make our half square triangles using our A and B fabrics. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of using a shortcut. I'm using these pre-made half square triangles that I had left over from a different block. So I'm going to trim these down to 1.5 inches, and then I will be able to move to step 2 and join those half square triangles with my C squares to make these 4-patch units. Okay, so my corner 4-patch units are done. When I was sewing the half square triangles and the C squares together, I pressed towards the half square triangle. It was a little bit bulky, but you can always use your easy press pen to help you get a flatter seam if you really would like that. And then as I joined the pairs together, I pressed that seam open. I prefer to press my seams open whenever I'm joining like little units like this. So now these are trimmed up to 2.5 inches for the 6-inch block, and they're ready to set aside. And now I can move on to the next step, which is to make my flying geese. So we use the 4-at-a-time flying geese method. And if this is your first time catching a Blockheads video, in several of my previous videos, I've gone into detail about how to make flying geese using the 4-at-a-time method. So I'm going to link some videos in the description below so that you can access those tutorials and watch those if you need a little bit more instruction. Otherwise, you know what to do at this point. So I'm going to pause and sew together my flying geese and come back, and we'll start assembling our block. Okay, my flying geese are made and trimmed. Now you see on these, my little triangles here are kind of curling up. And that's just because I haven't starched this woven fabric. It's totally okay. I'm just going to be really careful when I'm joining everything together so that I don't stretch this woven fabric by accident. But it's absolutely okay. If I had starched these, then they'd be laying a little bit flatter, but it's no problem. So I'm going to join my flying geese units together to make the chevron, just like it says in the pattern, and that'll be the last little step before the complete block assembly. Now don't forget, when you're joining your flying geese together, make sure that you have the point of your flying geese on the top so that you can see where you are when you're stitching them in your seam allowance and you don't lose your point there. So if I were to sew it this way with the larger triangle on top, I'm not going to see my point and I could miss it. So I always make sure to have the apex of my flying geese on the top so I can see where I am in my seam allowance and make sure that I don't lose my flying geese point. Okay, I've got my flying geese paired up, and for these I pressed towards the bottom flying geese unit so that I could avoid that bulk from pressing the seam open or pressing up this way. So that's the one time that I kind of divert from my typical rule of pressing seams open. So definitely press towards that bottom flying geese when you're making these units. Okay, now my block is ready to assemble. It's going to be so cute. I'm so excited. So when I start sewing these together, I'm going to press towards my corner units, I think, and then I'll press towards my center unit on this row. And then again, when I sew the rows together, I will press those seams open. Okay, so let's assemble this block. And here is my finished square burst block. Y'all, I am totally smitten with this block. I just love how it turned out. And what I love about it is it's a great example of some of my favorite things about the whole Blockhead series, which is it's just a great opportunity to explore fabric placement and pairing different fabrics, you know, working with what you have or challenging yourself to stick to a particular palette or any different combination of things that you can do. You can make it as fun or as much of a challenge as you'd like it to be. So even though we are doing similar techniques with the flying geese and the half square triangles, there's just always a way to mix it up and make it look fresh and different from all the other blocks. So I've also got my Americana block and I love it too. And you can see that even just with using different shades of fabrics and just kind of a different placement, that it gives a totally different effect. For both of these, I pressed my row seams open and I pressed towards the corner units for the top and bottom rows, and I pressed towards the center square for that center row. That helped my seams to nest nicely so that everything joined up really cleanly when I started sewing my rows together. My back sides are not quite as tidy as I normally like them to be. I'm very fastidious about the back of my blocks, but I'm working with unstarched wovens in both of these blocks, and it's totally worth it for the texture that they add to my block when it's done. So these are all this white, this light color blue dobby, and this darker denim blue dobby are all from Fig Tree and Company's Denim and Daisies Wovens, and that's going to be shipping later this summer, and you are going to want to have some of it for sure. It's a beautiful collection. Stephanie, thank you so much for designing Square Burst for us. This was such a fun block to sew. And as always, I can't wait to see how each of you interprets Square Burst. So if you haven't already joined our official Facebook group, please do so. I can't tell y'all how exciting it is to see everyone's blocks every week. I am so inspired by all of your blocks. Y'all do such a great job. And every week I see another block, I'm like, oh, I should have done that, or I just love it. So be sure to join us there and get inspired by the 73,000 other quilters in that group. It's a great group, very active, and we love to see everyone's blocks. Thanks so much for watching this week's video. I hope it's been helpful. Happy quilting, and we'll see you next time.